it's complex drug policy reform because it's like really scientific, and yet it's about people. It's about livelihoods, and it's about families, and somehow we need to do better at communicating that. The people walking, the people talking. I've been working at Health Poverty Action, which is an international development NGO. And I came to work for them specifically because I wanted to work on drug policy. And they are one of the few development organizations that prioritize drug policy reform as an area of work that directly impacts poverty and inequality. We took a decision at HPA, so instead of kind of focusing on the problem, which is the war on drugs or prohibition, galvanizing support and focusing on the solution, which we believe is legal regulation. So we're kind of looking at what does a post-prohibition world look like, and what does that transition look like, and what does the regulation look like from a development perspective. So we're sort of bringing the development voice to the drug policy reform conversations, but also using legal regulation as a means of, I suppose, future-proofing and inviting academics, people working in NGOs themselves to see that the future of drug policy reform has to include their perspectives, and they need to include drug policy reform into their agenda. I mean, looking at climate change, for instance, like we need to include drug policy when we're talking about climate justice. The problem that is happening because of prohibition, so prohibiting us from growing these crops, is that there is a vicious cycle of the cultivators going further into forest areas or protected areas to escape and disguise their crops in precious rainforest or mountains, and police forces kind of finding them, destroying those crops, and they go further up the mountain and the police find them. So there's this sort of cycle of environmental destruction that is often misunderstood as the drugs trade itself is propagating, but actually if there wasn't prohibition, then we could integrate these plants like we integrate coffee or tea plantations. If it was legal, farmers would be able to access and take part in sustainable farming practices. The one thing I would say that's really important with legal regulation is that the environmental element has to be a major priority in legal regulation, because what we are at risk of seeing is industrial sized farming of these new legal markets with the plants themselves, which would be catastrophic, because the last thing that this planet needs is more industrial agriculture. So it's an interesting example of why we need the soil experts, why we need the biodiversity experts, the NGOs, the farmers' unions, why we need those groups and that expertise to be integrated into legal regulation, is because small-scale farming, diverse farming, has a positive loop and is beneficial to those communities and to the farmers themselves, and ultimately to the planet. So it's just an example that if we rushed ahead and legally regulated without integrating the environmental element and protection, then we'd be replicating further damage for the environment. Our role in the development sector is really looking at how all these elements interact and how we would create a just transition from the illicit to the licit market for those whose livelihoods are dependent on the drugs trade. And the things that we often don't think are related are actually integral, is that we have an opportunity at the moment to write policy. The trade exists, right? The trade's illegal, but it exists. What we've been doing for decades is pretending it doesn't exist, that we don't need to deal or care for or support the rights of those people within it. The moment we move it to legal, we have an opportunity to write the best kind of policy. And here we've got this opportunity to write it from the offset. And with that, who writes it, how it's written, who's included in writing it. A really great example is New York. So New York, advocates in New York have been pushing for drug policy reform for many, many years. And they rejected the first draft. They rejected it because it didn't include social equity and racial justice enough. So it went a certain way, but it didn't go enough. So that's the energy in drug policy reform at the moment. Isn't that it's we're just going to hand this over to the biggest venture capitalists that are just going to take over the market. As advocates within the reform movement, our job is to ensure that the very best deal can be brokered, if you see what I mean, for the future, to protect those that have been impacted by the war on drugs, but B, who are entering this new market. I suppose what I'm interested in a bigger story, like this is not as simple as illegal or legal. The likelihood is that legal regulation is not going to solve all the problems of prohibition, but it is going to create a framework that will tackle a lot of the areas that have been pushed underground. We have an opportunity here to ensure that there's a level playing field with how that policy gets created. And that's our role as anyone who's interested, to do what you guys are doing and open up this conversation, destigmatize this conversation, ensure that people who have been using drugs or have been selling drugs are central, invited, felt safe enough, empowered enough to actually lead those that are sitting in the seats of power. Prohibition is so toxic that we don't need any more reports proving that prohibition is harming people across the world, and fortifying institutional racism at every stage. If we continue with the war on drugs, that only creates corruption at every level, and violence and distrust between public systems, whether that's education or health, and people. There's brilliant work, made a lot of work in the United States, but also all over the world, of impacted communities leading the way in drug policy reform. I think our role is 100% to make that as possible, as inviting, as safe, as respectful as possible, to that people feel that they can speak out, and inform, at the very least, the direction of the policy. And we are up against it. We're up against it. You know, the corporate lobbying and the corporate capture of this industry is like way ahead. They're like they've been having meetings with governments for years, that they've got the means and the resources to dominate that market completely. So it's a really, I think it's I don't think it's intentional that NGOs want to like speed it up, but I think it's something that we have to be like really mindful of how we work, and how we create environments. And when we talk about, who's got a seat at the table, well, like, who's booked the room, who's made the table, who sent out the invites, did you make sure that they got them? Like, it's just really about making like integrity, I think, and just being really careful and slower to check that integrity is being followed up and played out.